Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Marit Stiles, and I'm hosting a little live chat here on Instagram today. We're also going to be sharing it on my Facebook page, I think. And we're going to be talking about online learning, remote learning. But we're also going to be, mostly we're going to be talking actually about the Ford government's plan to expand and make permanent that remote learning that we've all been experiencing over the last year now in Ontario. I'm not super good at this, so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to stop and wave to everybody, but I'm going to try to keep up with it. Waved at a few people just now. And I see lots of people joining. Thanks so much. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in Behan Farhadi, who's an amazing expert on online remote learning, and you'll hear all about her. I'll introduce her when she comes on, and we're gonna be talking to her about some of her concerns about what the government's plan is. And you know what, we're also going to poke around a little bit, use her expertise a little to kind of maybe share her insights into what works and what doesn't, and things like that. And of course, we've all been sort of forced into this in this pandemic, and especially education workers, had to really pivot and have had to do it numerous times without a lot of support. So here comes Behan. I'm gonna try and get Behan in here now. Yep, here we go. We'll see. Hey, there you are. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. This is my first IG live. I'm pumped to be sharing that first time with you. I mean, terrible circumstances, but thank you for the invitation.
Well, it is terrible circumstances, and I mean we're both smiling because it's great to see you. And and I haven't done a lot of these either, so we're gonna see how this goes. I might actually later on. I know that I saw Trustee Norman De Pasquale is on this call as well. I thought he might have some interesting things to say, so maybe I'll invite him in later if I can figure out how to do that. I see my colleague MPP Dolly Begum here, and I'm the worst part about this whole, it's great, but this Instagram live thing is that I see all these people joining, and yet I sometimes I should be interacting with them, and I may have trouble doing that and also chatting. So you guys don't forgive me if I don't wave at all of you. I'm going to try my best here, and I'm going to keep also looking for questions. If you have questions for us, please put them in there. We'll try to get to some of them. But Behan, let me attempt to introduce you, and I'll start by introducing myself, just in case anybody missed this. I'm MPP Marit Stiles. I'm a member of provincial parliament here in Ontario. I represent the riding of Davenport, which is in sort of downtown West End Toronto. And I was a school board trustee for the public board in Toronto, the Toronto District School Board, for 4 years before I ran to be an MPP. And one of the reasons I ran to be a trustee and then I decided to run to be an MPP was because I was and I'm really passionate about public education, and I like a lot of people, and I really thought, we could be doing so much better. And, I just want to say it, under the previous government, we had this, they talked a lot about being the education government and everything, but, we really weren't seeing education funding, even keeping up with the rate of inflation. We saw a lot of our school buildings fall into disrepair, and I mean, some other troubling things. And I think we certainly, since the Ford government was elected, we've been confronted with some even more troubling issues. And we'll go into that in a minute. But let me introduce my partner here. Behan Farhadi is a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Education at York University, and also a secondary teacher with the Toronto District School Board. And I don't know, is there anything else you'd like to share about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wear both those hats at once, and it's really hard for me to take, because my work has come from my own practice. I also have 2 kids in the public board, and so it's all of this feels very personal as well.
Yeah, I'm a parent as well. I have one daughter who's in university, and I have a daughter who's still in high school, and these things are so like when people talk to you, I'm sure all the time about these issues and ask you questions, particularly around online learning and or remote learning, or we'll talk about what we can call it. You know, it is personal because your own children, your own family is going through this. You're teaching, you have taught in this, and in fact, the way we connected originally, I think, was I'm trying to remember, but I can't remember how I found out about you. But it was in that first conversation that the government was starting to have. The Ford government back a couple of years ago, well, 3 years ago now, when right after they were elected, and they started talking about having mandatory online courses and making that mandatory in high schools. And I remember, you know, I think I'd heard, I don't remember how again, about you working on your doctoral dissertation, doing research in this area that nobody else was doing. And
no, it was like the least sexy project on the face of the planet. Like nobody understood. I was in the Department of Geography, and nobody understood why I was there, why I was doing work in education. It's you know, it's quite something to be here talking not just about, you know, the mandatory e-learning blew my mind at the time, and then of course, you know, the pandemic just makes everything surreal. So this is like this proposal is I don't want to sound inflammatory, but it sounds like it feels like such a big hit to the public education system in a way that people don't quite understand, because the term online learning sounds fuzzy and nice, and technology makes us feel good because we use it all the time. So there's so much, I think, work to be done in terms of informing people of what the details of this proposal is. And Marit, I've been like so grateful for your voice at Queen's Park, because otherwise a lot of these claims that the minister and this government are making goes unchecked.
well, thanks. I mean, I got to tell you, I think I've said it before to you, but it has felt like a real privilege, especially in this moment, even before the pandemic hit, to be able to hopefully amplify or at least bring the voices of folks into the legislature. It's, you know, I'm not an educator. And I'm not a teacher. I haven't worked in education, and so for me, it's really super important. It always has been to actually hear directly from people, both the experts and the frontline educators who are also the experts, and also, you know, I'm going to say it because I see a lot of people joining in here, and there's like students joining, I think, and a lot of young people. A lot of teachers and other education workers joining, and I really appreciate everything you guys are doing out there. So we'll back up for just 1 second here. So just to set the stage, because we had the government put forward this proposal for 4 mandatory online learning courses like 2.5 years ago. Then the unions and parents and students all said, like, we don't want this. It doesn't work for anyone. And so there were walkouts, there were work actions. It became a central issue in bargaining. The education unions pushed back quite significantly, and I think where we landed was 2 mandatory online courses, but the government basically allows people to be exempted from it. It's still problematic. But they backed off quite a bit in the end. However, then the pandemic hit, and everybody was pushed into this remote emergency online learning. And then, and so we've all been navigating this. And then what you were just talking about is that just, my gosh, it feels like a year ago, but I think it was a week and a half ago, it came out that the government is talking, is consulting, but they seem to be very clear they're moving forward in a plan to make remote learning, online learning, they're going to expand it and make it permanent, and expand it to younger kids too. So maybe do you want to, and I want to also, just before I go any further, mention that you wrote an amazing op-ed in the Toronto Star last weekend, which I think I've tried to post the link in Twitter, so folks will post it later too, but be sure to read it. And anyways, I'm going to turn over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we understand that they're proposing at this stage?
For sure. So there's so many pieces to this. So we have since the pandemic, remote learning, online learning, there's an important difference between synchronous or live instruction and asynchronous, which is kind of like module based. You take it at your own time. What has, with the pandemic, the option given to families and the uptake has been largely asynchronous. There has been some exceptions to that where there are boards who have been unwilling or unable to put forward the funding to provide synchronous instruction because it's resource intensive. And so what they've done is actually there are a few boards who have relied on the Independent Learning Center this year, in fact, and has not experienced success in it. And what has happened is, and what that is basically, and this is an important piece, the Independent Learning Center is a distance education provider in Ontario that serves largely 16 plus. And they are, this is all content that is delivered by Desire to Learn, a company that was entrenched through, a few governments back. And it's important that this particular model is asynchronous, but there isn't a teacher. There's a teacher marker in one, so you don't really talk to the teacher. There's also an academic advisor that provides answers for your questions. So the kind of labor is like split. You don't have that kind of one-on-one instruction. That's a really important distinction, because what's happening now is, we've had this uptake, and the ministry is saying in their proposal that there's a demand for it. Well, of course, there's a demand. There is a demand because there is a pandemic. And rather than continuing to fund remote learning in secondary and elementary, which they had been doing this year through this kind of COVID emergency fund, because we're not out of the pandemic. So rather than just continuing to fund that for another year and perhaps restricting it a little bit more in terms of the number of times parents can and families can switch, what they've said is you have to continue to provide this. We're not providing you any funding for it going forward, but what we are going to do is legislate in the Independent Learning Center to essentially fill the gap, right? So what this sounds like is, they're saying it's a choice, but what I've seen through the comments, I think even the last comment, and even my own research and what we see up north in terms of why it's been used. And by the way, folks I've spoken with, in the north don't like it, but they have to. It's not really a choice. They're not funding class, the appropriate. We're not getting the funding we need for the classes face to face. So what you're forced into is online learning, simply because there isn't the funding in the face to face environment. So my question is, and I'll end with this, is would we need online learning? Would it be a choice for families if we had buildings that weren't crumbling, classrooms that allowed for a humane, interaction where teachers aren't scrambling to meet the diverse needs of learners, special education funding? Would we need to have like an anti-racism plan, an indigenous, developed curriculum? Would we need these things if we had the resources in the face-to-face environment? And I guess if the answer to that is no, then we're really looking at online learning, the standardized one-size-fits-all through the ILC largely, because that's where the demand is going to move, because we won't be able to meet the demand in remote because we don't have the funding that we're going to get. Is that good for kids?
And they're going to expand. I mean, the proposal is as well, what they're shopping around is to expand it. Not, as you said, right now it exists for 16 plus, but this would, what they're proposing would expand it to, I think, all grades.
Yeah, so they have at the moment limited elementary to the remote, but I do know that TVO ILC has developed curriculum for elementary, right? And what I worry about is that, when we think about what education means, this is a very transactional definition of education. And it's a definition of education that creates a two-tier system, because anyone it doesn't require research, although research has already, demonstrated the resources a family needs to support students. We know we need a caregiver at home, especially for younger ages. They need a quiet space to work. They need, so they need the technology and the connection and the materials. So the families at home are kind of taking the place in some ways of what some of the motivation that the teacher provides, and not every family can do that.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that in this pandemic. It's what everybody was warning them about, and one of the big concerns generally about remote learning, online learning, was that different capacity. I always like to think of it as like capacity, because it isn't just so much like, do you have the technology? It's what's the reality you live with in your home? What are the challenges you yourself experience as a parent, and as well as your children, right? Like all of those different factors play in. And I think, the government likes to think that if they can just talk about like, well, we're gonna expand broadband, we're gonna throw more iPads at kids, that's somehow gonna, deal with those equity issues. But it's just such a limited perspective. I mean, I wonder also, because I was reading your op-ed in the Toronto Star, I'm going to mention that again, last weekend, and I've heard, I've read like Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, but you talk a lot about the role that I guess disaster capitalism, and how this government is using this moment, exploiting this moment, which many governments have done, and we usually see it in terms of pushing austerity plans, or making cuts in different areas for government, right? Because, oh my goodness, now we have this massive deficit. But using these moments to push through things that otherwise people just wouldn't stand for. And especially in a moment when people are so, we're dealing with so much already, to try to sneak this stuff through. And I wonder if you want to just comment a little bit on like the timing of all of this.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not on its face, right, an austerity policy, so to speak, but it's certainly making us very comfortable, they're also preparing for an election. And I say that because politics is, e-learning is politicized. And so my arguments have always been on the basis of this being politicized. I am not interested in the theoretical success, models of online learning. I'm interested in the history of the ways that the state has used online learning to cut costs in education, and where that has led us. Because in the United States, which has been really like the stronghold for this, it is shocking to see not only the ways that online learning has become privatized and sold, but the ways that families are flocking to it for the reasons that I outlined, because there aren't investments in public education. And so to talk about this sort of disaster capitalism, I think about, we're not just, this is a concert of suggestions. Like, they're also giving cash payouts to families and taking away like tens of $1,000s like per school. And this is making families, what it's doing is saying you're entitled to the money that is like, that belongs to your child. And this gets a sense of we're not taking care of each other, especially during a pandemic, when we know that money is better put to use to resolve the deep inequities and the lack of funding in the public education system. So this is absolutely making folks, it's to me exploiting the fear I have right now around, we're still in the pandemic. There's not a sense that it's going to end. I was surprised in the Yes op-ed that the argument for it was that we're going to continue to have pandemics. Right. And so
that's kind of what the government says. Like, when I raise it, and I mean, ever since the pandemic hit and everybody had to shift into this remote distance emergency learning thing, that's what Lecce always says. That's what the minister always says when I mention online learning at all. He says, well, thank goodness we were ready to go. We were investing in this. We were expanding, and you guys didn't like it. And I go, are you kidding me? Really, and that is exactly where they go, right? And so that's interesting, because yes, I should mention that there were two baffling op-eds in the Toronto Star, and I thought, yeah.
And so it is this idea, they're very strategic about how they're placing it. They're like, this thing you've been doing all year, that is what we want to legislate. When they're really saying, this thing that you've been doing out here, you're not getting that funded anymore. But we're going to have this alternative cheap cheap alternative for you, which is going to take away all the possible. I mean, it's not perfect, but at least you're connected to a teacher. At least you're able to feel like you're connected to your school board. That is, they're going to say it's a choice. It's going to be there, but boards can't fund it. And what I've seen during this pandemic as well is boards, again, unwilling to fund it, not only have turned to TVO, but even, you know, I don't know which is worse. They're the ones streaming in folks into the classroom. So rather than having a dedicated teacher, boards have gone the route, because it's the path of least resistance, because it's the cheaper plan, to simply stream students into the classroom. And now there are these simultaneous debates of like, we're asking teachers to do two things at the same time, to teach two groups of students at the same time. So I just like the message to me, like for families, is whatever benefits that families are experiencing, it's unlikely that's going to stay the course, because we're not providing the funding for it.
That's a really interesting point. And I mean, I think it's really important to point out to folks who are watching us right now that, you know, even in the latest budget that the government just released a couple weeks ago, they are actually cutting education. Not just, and I want to point out, it's not just that they aren't leaving the funding in that was the sort of one-time emergency funding. They're also not planning to fund education over the next few years at this, you know, even to keep up with the rate of inflation, which is a cut. So, and then there is explicitly in this proposal, as you mentioned, saying there won't be any funding for this, for boards. So I think that's a really interesting point that I have to say I hadn't really caught as much as I think you're making that point really, really clearly. And your point as well, and I guess it would be worth, you keep talking about, you know, the choice that they're giving, and that's the government's language, right, is choice. This is about choice. And whenever I hear a conservative government, any government, neoliberal government talk about choice, I know what they mean, and that all the flags go off for me, because we've seen what happened in the United States. Like, we've seen what's happened in other jurisdictions. You know, this in our province right now, we don't have funding for private education. We have a, you know, massive number of private schools, and lots of people, unfortunately, I think, choosing that. And I see people commenting here about how many families they talk to who are like saying, I have to look at this for my good of my children right now. I mean, and this is ultimately, I think, where we all, those of us certainly on the left, and I've been concerned, is that this is what they're doing. This is the bigger plan. This is undermining public education, boosting up their friends in, you know, in the corporate side in private education, but also, you know, moving funding out of public education and into those private options, choices. And one of the ways that we've seen that happen in the United States is through voucher charter schools. And so whenever they talk about that, and that's definitely an idea they have also floated. So, I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about like what the experience has been in the US and how, I guess, the sort of education as a commodity has evolved.
Yeah, I mean, we don't even have to look to the US. We can look to Alberta, right? Like right, like Ontario has, because my research right now is actually focused comparatively with Alberta and Ontario. And I've noticed since the beginning, they've just been lockstep in terms of the policies with regards to pandemic education. And what I noticed, you know, in Alberta, they took the word public out of the description of schooling. So there was this kind of ideological push to remove that distinction. There was a Choice in Education Act that was passed that really just lifted the lid off of charters. And so, you know, the OECD has, you know, done research on choice education. And look, I mean, where they show success has always been countries, small countries with tons of funding for public education, high taxes, right? Like that, where people are paying, investing in education broadly. And so it's really like this idea is not, it doesn't become competition. Whereas in the US, and I think that really is an important point, because virtual education has been in large part been driven by corporate. Just like 3 companies really have the market on this, and they are putting it through charter schools, which are sort of publicly funded, but in like a business for a school, independently run, as they say. But you know, in Alberta too, we had the Alberta the Distance Learning Center, the LDC, which I would say is maybe the equivalent of TVO. And I think some people will argue like TVO, they're like Crown owned, right? Like the government owns it, right? Sure, but like what happened with Alberta Learning Distance, they were the only ones that were block funded by the province, and just last year funding got taken. So here we have funding taken away from what we were framing, but there's demand that was created, right? So now there's like, they have this demand that they can't fill. Who's going to fill that gap? There are tons of companies ready to go. There were tons of companies ready to go as soon as mandatory e-learning was announced. We knew that there were reports of companies like even when I was doing research in 2016, there were surveillance companies approaching administrators asking about proctoring students, because what happens is when you scale up to this degree, you're going to start to rely on surveillance technology to sort of respond to this mythical idea that like students are, you know, untrustworthy, they're going to cheat, rather than producing material that they can connect with, rather than producing material that they can co-construct. So we're moving toward this, again, transactional model of education that has absolutely gutted public education in the United States, has had quite poor results. I mean, I always have encouraged those proponents of online learning to at least show me any example where it's been mass delivered and succeeded, and they can't.
And again, just for those people who are just now joining us, you know, to reiterate, you know, again, like what we were talking about is this government's proposal, and we've seen, I mean, to expand to, and you've explained that so brilliantly, but you know, the situation we're in right now is very different. And so the experience that people are having right now is even, I mean, it's, do you want to maybe reflect on that a little bit? Like, people are always saying to me, so I actually had some people say to me, you know, well, my kid really was having anxiety issues at school, and moving to remote was actually not, you know, it worked for them okay. And then I, of course, have had, you know, many other people say this is just a disaster for us, and our whole family is really struggling because of this. But you know, how does that compare to some of the things that we're again, I know we're kind of repeating into this, but that's the joy of the live chat. But can you just, you know, reflect a little bit so people who are listening to this understand a little bit about the distinction here as well?
I also, and want to like bust the myth that online learning has just suddenly appeared. Like it's always been there for accommodations and accessibility. I think we could do a better job, of course, of just making education more accessible. I think there's some myths around accessibility and what that means. But oftentimes, I mean, I've also heard just as recently someone saying, making the argument that, you know, if a student's being bullied at school, they can like go online. Well, that's not addressing the problem, right? Like that, you know, we can't keep throwing these technological solutions to really complex problems. We have a cultural problem in the school if we have, you know, instances of harm, right? And so my question is, why aren't we addressing that harm in a face-to-face environment rather than just using this quick fix to basically get the kid out of our face, right? Like that's to me what it sounds like. Yeah. And so I've always been of the mind that like there's been lots of teachers who have been incorporating technology for at least a decade. I've interviewed them. You know, they've said to me, no one's asked us about what we're doing. We're just kind of doing it. So I would say that, you know, this has been happening, that this isn't kind of like, we don't need to arrive at the 21st century. We've been here for a long time. But what's on offer is this kind of, it's a marketing scheme, right? It's a marketing tactic to make it sound as if it's never existed. And I do think that for families, again, I think there's families that my position is like, let's continue remote in the way that it's being done at a smaller scale for another year, because I think there are going to be families who don't feel like, from a just physical safety perspective, want to be there. And then let's take a look at what the outcomes look like, right? But in any case, we can't keep, you know, online is expensive. Right? Remote instruction is expensive, and we need to think about what the function of schooling is in communities and the degree to which students are removed from that. Because this proposal also is saying that students are going to be connected to their home schools, but we've done that this year. That has not worked whatsoever. Like it's clear that families have felt disconnected from their schools. And I also will say, the last thing I'll say is, there's also the argument around success rates. And I know the TDSB put out in just maybe 2 meetings ago, this kind of like preliminary data around like how students were doing. And what it found was, okay, yes, there was success in terms of but there was also direction from the board to, modify assessments. But what they did find kind of overwhelmingly is that students felt a lack of belonging and wanted to be back face to face. So I think that this what success looks like can't just be grades. It needs to be student, feeling connected and feeling like a sense of belonging to their communities. Hi, Norm.
Yeah, sorry, surprise.
That was great. I love it.
I said I'm kind of new at this, so I'm like trying to figure out how to invite Norm in. Everybody, this is Trustee Norm DePasquale, who's Toronto Catholic District School Board trustee and a great advocate for public funded education. And I noticed he was in here, so I thought I'd bring him in and see maybe if he wanted to make some comments or ask Van some questions as well. It's good to see you, Norm.
Well, thank you, Mara. It's a pleasure to see you, and thank you for everything you do every day in Queen's Park. And it's a pleasure to live tweet you from there when I can.
yeah, I really appreciate that.
No problem. And Behan, I really appreciate your leadership in this area. I really don't know where we would be without your expertise.
Hey, the respect is mutual. Thank you.
A real pleasure.
Yeah.
Behan, you hit on something I think that's key here. Like our local school communities, they're like the sun and the moon for our students. Like they really revolve around these. And the further we take them away from their local school context, as we would if we were centrally delivering something like this, the more disconnected they feel from their community, from their school, the less motivated they're going to feel. And I just completely agree with your assessment there.
Yeah, and it to me is the core of this proposal. What value do we place on education? What does education mean? Because that's always what it comes back to for me when people are arguing for this. I'm like, what is it? Just accreditation? Because if it is accreditation, then it's often the case that they're maybe not supporting public schools, because public schools, like the definition in the Education Act, is not just about accreditation and skill building. It's also about like citizenship and inclusivity and being a part of a community, right? So social cohesion, I think, is something that we in Canada like to put our hats on as being something we're really good at, right? But this, this kind of proposal, the ideology that's informing this proposal really undercuts those values.
Hey, absolutely. I mean, one of the greatest things I've ever heard is schools are community hubs. They should be community hubs. And this is where our young grow into contributing members of their local community and society. And the further we pull them away from this, the more disconnected they will feel from their local community. And that just damages society as a whole.
And, can I just say something on that point too, because kind of feeding back to something Ben said earlier, we've heard governments say that all the time. Oh, schools are community hubs, schools as community hubs. And then they talk about proposals for how they're going to start to invest in schools as community hubs. Instead of just saying like, okay, schools are community hubs. How do we invest properly? How are we actually investing and taking action and providing all of the resources and tools that we need in our community schools to make them better places, to fulfill the needs that as Behan pointed out, that online education is supposedly filling?
Yeah, absolutely. And, when the government cuts things like the Priority Schools Initiative, which was allowing community groups free access to our schools, it cut out the needs of 188,000 at-risk school children in Toronto. So, if schools are community hubs, let's invest in them and let's make sure that even if remote instruction must continue, let's deliver it locally so that you get that local context and students continue to feel connected to their community. I'm all about that.
I want to mention here while we're sitting here that I've seen a lot of amazing educators joining us. I saw Rich Gelder, who said, I worked in this. I've done TI online for 17 years. Yep. And I have D. Tyler Robinson here, who's part of a group that's been developing an amazing anti-Black racism curriculum in our schools, which is just extraordinary and a great opportunity for another live chat maybe soon. Anyways, I just wanted to also just, I mean, while we're kind of, as we maybe are going to wrap this up in a couple minutes, I wanted to ask you how we, and I mean, I have my own thoughts on how we push back, but I think that's the other question I get the most from people is like, what can we do to stop this? And I want to point out again that there's really two different things going on now, right? There's what we need in this moment, in this pandemic, and then there's what this government is proposing to do. And again, like this is not ideal. The situation before was not ideal, but there really are kind of two things happening here. And I really feel like the government, again, is taking advantage of the fact that we are isolated. We are literally isolated, many of us, again. And families are up to here struggling. Education workers are exhausted. Students are, not in a space where they can walk out like they have in the past, which really, by the way, really impacted this government. When those students walked out in protest of the changes and the rolling back of the health and physical education curriculum in this province, a couple of years ago now, and the Indigenous writing sessions that were taking place around Indigenous curriculum, that was the first moment I saw the government really shaking, and they backed away a bit, and I think that there's a real lesson in that, and there's no coincidence that this government is using this moment to float this idea, and I think they're gonna make an announcement soon, and they're gonna legislate this. So what can we do to push back? How can we organize? I mean, I say that and I have a few ideas, but what do you guys think? What should folks out there be doing to push back on this idea with the government?
For me, I think the first issue is just to make sure that the public understands what's at stake here. Like, whatever the messaging is has to be understandable. Like something like keep learning local. Like what's at stake here? Should this continue through? I think it just needs to be clearly understandable to the public.
A true organizer. You are, Norm. True organizer. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, there's, for me, this is a test, and the degree to which they're going to proceed with this plan as it stands will depend on the kind of pushback they receive. How do they track pushback? Well, in a digital era, they are tracking pushback. I think they put out a job for social media, like someone actually whose job is exclusively to track social media. They're looking at the number of emails that they receive. They're looking at conversations that are taking place in all kinds of forums. And so there is a sense, there is a kind of like an objective way that they determine like what is causing conversation, and that the more engaged we are with informing people of what this plan actually is, I think that is the biggest thing, because we're in the middle of this pandemic and they're saying we're going to make the headlines are making remote learning permanent, which is saying we're going to make what you're doing right now just, an option for you, which sounds really like innocent and benign, instead of just like, well, we're going to just create a whole new regulatory system that is going to take away the authority that school boards will have to respond to their local contexts in a way that meets the needs of students. And that's a debate in itself, but like, that's to me not the concern right now. My concern is this like very real and present danger of continuing to take away powers from school boards to be able to me in a humane way respond to what students need in an otherwise framed way to compete, right? So there's those impacts I don't think are clear.
And I think so, and I completely agree with you on the digital side. And I want to say to folks who are watching right now that, I always get asked, what can I do? Should I send an email? Like, well, I always send emails and they never get back to me, or I call and they never respond, and how much it doesn't do any good. And I got to tell you, I'm in that role now. I'm an elected politician, and we watch very closely how many emails we get. Even the auto-generated ones that you have, we count them, we watch them. My office, we try to actually respond to them, but I can't say that for the Conservatives. But they do watch that, and they are going to be keeping an eye on that for sure. And you're right. And I also want to mention, I mean, Behan said at the beginning of this, we are, the election is looming for these guys, and I think that's a really important point to make, because we look at the polls out there and people say, oh, he's doing so well and he's so high in the polls, but I don't think this is a real sense of how people are feeling out there. And the government knows that, and they're afraid. And we need to shake them a little bit more. And unfortunately, this is about election cycles. Our system works this way. So they know when the election is approximately going to happen, approximately June next year, and they're going to be watching these issues very closely. And I mean, first of all, I'm just going to say it, going to defeat them next year. And replace them. But we also have to, in the meantime, we have to make sure that we push this particular issue as far as we can, so they don't get there, they don't start to sort of sink their teeth into it and move it forward. So, and you mentioned, I think, Norm, the message and how we talk about it. So, and you had some suggestions, and it's tricky because, like Behan said, it's important that people also really understand why this matters, because in this moment, you're absolutely right. People are not, they're thinking, okay, maybe that makes sense. But I think you've made the point very effectively today about why it's not the same thing, why we need to be concerned, why we need to be really deeply concerned. So maybe we ask everybody out there to start, sharing and talking about this issue, sharing some of the messages that we've been communicating today. And also, I'm going to be posting an online petition soon, which will people can add their name to and share. Any other thoughts, you guys, on things that we can do? I know that some of the associations, like the Ontario School Board Association, is speaking out, which is good. Anything else that you guys can think of?
I will say one thing. Yeah. Do what you're closest to. It doesn't have to be this big, shiny, pretty thing. Whatever you have capacity to do is better than doing nothing. And there are many, many folks who are doing work already, in fact, whose lead we can follow when there are actions that are taking place. So continuing to monitor the kind of organizing that's happening, and also doing when you're feeling whatever it is, whether it's speaking to a neighbor, whether it's speaking to somebody in the school yard, whether it's sending an email, it's a network. Organization, for me, organizing is about networks. It's not about this top down, and it's not just about bottom up. It's about the ways that we all kind of are interconnected and and our power is interconnected. And
somebody here is saying to me, we can share, but most people in our networks are like-minded. And that tends to be the case. We tend to have people who our friends or people we identify with or share similar values. But those people can talk to other people, I completely agree with you, Behan. We really don't need to think. What we really need to be doing right now is talking to each other and taking those small steps that are doable. And I'm sorry, I think Trustee Norm got kicked off somehow, and I apologize. I hope you didn't get kicked off, but he's saying, talk to 5 people. That David Crombie, folks will remember David Crombie, a Conservative, who has spoken out against this government on other issues, who said, talk to 5 people. And I think that is really how this begins and how this grows. And then people like myself and people like Behan, who have some platform, can really bring those voices forward. But we are going to have to win through that kind of organizing approach, I think.
Yeah, and Joy, I'm just going to read your comment. Be like tree roots. They stretch miles and interact with one another. So that's a nice way.
That's a really nice sentiment. Yeah. Well, listen, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And it's fun to talk. I feel like this is kind of, I love this format, actually. It's kind of fun. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time with me today and for sharing some of your thoughts. And really, I really have to say, for me, I haven't, in the last couple of weeks since this landed on us again, I haven't had a lot of time to really stop and think about what this means and some of the deeper issues that are really troubling. And so I really appreciate your bringing your expertise to this. And
Thank
experience.
you. Like it's so mutual, like so grateful to be working in community with you, you know, for common ends with common values. And, you know, one can just hope that it spreads. And
yeah, well, this is a start, right? So thank you again so much. And hey, everybody out there, I also wanted to say, I know this has been a really tough few days for a lot of people. And, you know, I think we're all feeling it. And I go to the coffee shop on the corner and people are bummed out. And I talk to parents who are really upset. And there's a lot of uncertainty. So we're thinking about you. You're not alone. I know this, say that, but there are folks out there advocating, and we will get through this. But I think what's really important is that we all, as Behan said, we take kind of the piece that we can, what we can manage right now. You're a parent and you're an educator. You have any final words, just general words of advice or wisdom for people right now?
I just have a deep sigh.
I know, deep sigh.
I mean, look, hey, look, we're not all carrying the burden equally. There's no doubt, but I think that the state of things weighs heavily on us, and it weighs heavily on us because we care. And I just say, like, don't lose hope. You know,
Yeah,
it's
really important.
This is history is always been there, and there's another side, and whatever that look like, we have to sort of emerge from that space with hope.
Thank you so much. And thank you again to everybody who joined us. I see Judy Kramer. I see D. Tyler Robinson. Oh my gosh, I can't see the list anymore. I don't know where it goes. But I've seen amazing, amazing people join us today who are also like extraordinary and experts in many ways. And I hope we'll be able to have more chats like this. All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.